Insulin resistance is really a coin with two sides. Now, the coin that I would be holding, this allegorical coin, would be called insulin resistance. And this is the insulin resistance that we see in the human body, whether it is those more clinically relevant cases of pathological insulin resistance, or whether it's the physiological insulin resistance that happens during puberty and during pregnancy.
Right.
But regardless, anytime we're calling something insulin resistance in the body, it's this coin with two sides.
Sure.
On one side is the fact that insulin isn't working the same way that it used to. So the hormone insulin isn't able to do all the things it used to at some of the cells of the body. Emphasis on some of the cells.
Right.
Most of the body's cells respond to insulin as well as they ever did. So it's not like it's a global or universal phenomenon within the body. But the other side of that coin is hyperinsulinemia, or chronically elevated blood insulin levels. These two things will always come together: compromised insulin signaling and chronically elevated insulin itself. Whether it is a pathological insulin resistance that's making the person sick, or whether it is the physiological insulin resistance, which is helping that boy or girl grow very rapidly during puberty, or whether it's helping mommy's body and baby-to-be's body grow in order, throughout the pregnancy. In all of these instances, it's the combination of those two variables, or both sides of the coin. You can't have one without the other. One way of looking at it is looking at insulin resistance as being a result of primary causes or a result of secondary causes. With regards to primary causes, these are stimuli that can cause insulin resistance independent of anything else. And it can cause it all around the body at various cells, at fat cells, muscle cells, liver cells, etc., brain cells. And so there are three primary causes of insulin resistance, as I define it. And by that, I mean, you can take humans and isolated cells, and if you expose them to all three of these things that I'll mention in a moment, then they'll become insulin resistant. And that is elevated levels of inflammatory proteins, so inflammation, elevated levels of stress hormones, and that's cortisol and epinephrine. And then lastly, chronically elevated levels of insulin. So inflammation, stress, and insulin. Now, inflammation and stress are so widely thrown around these days. In pop culture, everyone wants to blame everything on stress or blame everything on inflammation. And so I'm being very careful using those words. But when we can detect elevated levels of inflammatory proteins or hormones, then the body will become insulin resistant as a direct result. Same with those stress hormones, cortisol and epinephrine. Everything else can be fine, but if those hormones are up for too long, then the body starts to become insulin resistant. And then what I believe is the most relevant, because you can change it so quickly, is the chronically elevated insulin, where too much insulin is causing the body to become resistant to it. So those are the primary causes. And then the secondary cause, I believe, is something like linoleic acid is a prime example of that, because you can't treat cells with, like muscle cells, with linoleic acid and then they become insulin resistant. It doesn't happen. The same with neurons in the brain. It doesn't happen. What can happen is that linoleic acid can do all kinds of bad things in the body from these refined seed oils. But just for to see it through the lens of insulin resistance, I believe it's secondary, because when the fat cells start to accumulate linoleic acid, it forces the fat cells to grow through a process called hypertrophy. Right. And when the fat cells are each individually getting too big rather than multiplying in number, then those bigger or hypertrophic fat cells become insulin resistant. And so in other words, the seed oils can promote insulin resistance through the body, but it would be in part due to what it's doing at the fat cells by making the fat cells grow in a harmful way. And then the fat cells are promoting the insulin resistance throughout the body. If someone sleeps poorly one night, they will have demonstrable, detectable insulin resistance the next day. That is something that can be quantified in a lab. And it is entirely a result of the elevated cortisol because of the bad sleep. Now, thankfully, that very kind of rapid onset insulin resistance can be corrected by just one good night of sleep. But you can imagine all of these variables coming into play in the average person, where the average individual has terrible sleep habits. They have terrible dietary habits where they're eating refined starches and sugars every 2 or 3 hours. So their insulin's elevated all the time. And they may or may not be exposing themselves to foods or chemicals that are aggravating their immune system and thus increasing inflammatory proteins. And to top it all off, in addition to those primary causes, they're eating their carbs from bags and boxes with barcodes, which means that the fats in them will always be seed oil fats, high in linoleic acid. So it is just an absolute perfect storm of variables that are coming in to play to create insulin resistance. And I think it's important for me to emphasize that as much as I'm talking about stress, inflammation, insulin, and even linoleic acid as all distinct in their ability to induce insulin resistance, in our environment, you simply have all of them.
Yeah.
And so trying to tease them out or rank order them, which one's worse, I can't do that. I don't know of any studies that have attempted to, say which one is worse than the others. I think in general, a person who just says, I'm going to eat more animal products and have them replace processed carbohydrates, that's going to be an absolute win, because you will be eliminating the insulin spiking nature and the seed oils that come with it. So you're eliminating a primary and a secondary cause of insulin resistance. And then the degree to which the differing meats would have differing levels of omega-6s, that to me is so little. It's so much less. The moment you stop eating the crackers and the salad, the ranch dressing with soybean oil and all that other junk, you have done so much. But having said that, I am an enormous advocate of beef over chicken.
Okay.
And the differing fatty acid profile and the overall amount of fat is a part of that, frankly. But it's more a matter of beef is just better than chicken, I think, in overall health within the overall composition of nutrients. The glucose levels hovering around the 90s, my view, frankly, is there's nothing more pathological about having a glucose of 95 than there is a glucose of 85. I know of no studies that have shown any conclusive evidence whatsoever that kind of 10 milligram per deciliter change is going to be anyway harmful. So I don't think people need to get too worried about that, even maybe around 100, frankly. I think that is all within a normal range. It's all in a healthy, normal range. Now, however, the other aspect of this that you mentioned is, why would that be happening? Why would someone who's eating essentially a zero carbohydrate diet have an increase in their glucose, or at least an inability of it to drop? There is no answer to that question. That is probably the single most common question I've ever been asked in my whole time being involved in podcasts and social media. My theory is some people are more protein sensitive than other people. So we know that amino acids will have a stimulatory effect of stimulating glucagon release from the pancreas. And we know in type 2 diabetics, we know that this can happen in people where they eat a certain load of protein and they will have a much higher glucagon release than someone who's not a diabetic. I think that there are people who have that similar protein sensitivity and a much higher release of glucagon in response to protein than other people do. And when glucagon goes up, it wants to increase glucose in the blood. And so that's where I think it's happening in some of these people that adopt essentially zero carb diets.